All right, so picture this, okay? Just imagine for a second. What if, like for a whole day, every single law just vanished? Poof, gone.
No laws at all.
Yeah, no laws, no speed limits, no rules about, stealing or anything like that. Like those signs that say do not enter, gone. What do you think would happen, even just in our own neighborhoods?
Well, our sources for this deep dive actually talk about that kind of life without law scenario.
Yeah.
And it's a pretty intense thought. I mean, imagine, right? Just complete and utter chaos.
Yeah.
I don't think it'd be a very fun day.
Probably not, no. And it really makes you appreciate, like, why we need some kind of framework for how we live together, right? It's not just about, being told what to do, but about actually, like, having a society that can function.
And what's interesting is this isn't some new idea. I mean, this deep dive this time takes us way back to the Israelites after they left Egypt. They were in this crazy new situation, like a total reset, and they needed a whole new system for how they were going to live as a people, as a nation. And that's where we get the Mosaic covenant and those famous 10 commandments.
Right, like these ultimate guidelines. But we're not just talking ancient history here. Our sources really stress that these laws, these commandments, they go way deeper.
Oh, absolutely.
They get at like the core of what it means to be human, and even in a way what we can understand about, God or the divine.
Yeah, that's the really fascinating part, that connection.
So, okay, just imagine. These Israelites have been slaves in Egypt for generations, right? They finally get free thanks to, some pretty miraculous events. And now they're wandering in this wilderness, headed for Canaan.
Talk about a culture shock.
Huge. They go from this like super controlled life where every detail was dictated to basically like freedom. But with freedom comes the need for like a whole new set of rules, a new way of organizing themselves, because they're not just a big family anymore. They're becoming a nation.
Yeah, you really have to think about that transition.
Yeah.
Exodus 19 talks about them arriving at Mount Sinai or Horeb.
Right, the mountain of God.
And you have to remember everything they just went through, right?
Yeah.
The escape from Egypt, the plagues, the Red Sea. I mean, their whole world has just been flipped upside down.
Totally.
So now they're in this in-between space, and there's a real need for structure. And kind of like that life without law thing we talked about. God steps in to provide this newly freed nation with some guidelines to prevent chaos.
Right, because without some kind of order, things could fall apart pretty quickly.
Absolutely. And that's where this covenant comes in that framework for their new society. And especially those 10 commandments. It's all about establishing order and cohesion.
So for everyone listening, that's what this deep dive is all about, right? We're unpacking this Mosaic covenant, getting to the core of those 10 commandments and what they really meant. And hopefully it'll give you a better understanding of this pivotal moment in history and why those principles still matter today, maybe in ways you hadn't considered before.
Okay, so to start, we need to define what a covenant actually is. And from our source material, it's basically like a formal agreement.
Right.
Kind of like a contract, but with a much deeper meaning.
Yeah, like a really serious promise.
Yeah, exactly. It outlines, the relationship between the parties involved, the obligations that each side has, and the benefits that come with upholding those obligations.
Right, like a you do this, I'll do that kind of deal. But this Mosaic covenant, it wasn't the first time God had done something like this, was it? I mean, we see these covenants popping up throughout the Old Testament, like with Noah, and then, of course, the really important one with Abraham.
That's a really good point. It's like a progression, God establishing relationships, making these commitments with humanity over time. And then with the Mosaic covenant, we're focusing on that specific agreement made with Abraham's descendants, Jacob's family, which became the Israelites.
So it's like building on that foundation, that history of these agreements.
Exactly. And what's really insightful is how this Mosaic covenant starts. It doesn't just jump into the rules, it begins with a kind of historical prologue, like God reminding Israel of what he'd already done for them.
Like a reminder of why this covenant matters so much.
Yeah. Exodus 19, verse 4 is key here. It says, "You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself."
Wow, that's powerful imagery. So it's like God saying, remember all that stuff with the plagues, the slavery, the Red Sea. Remember who brought you out of all that? That was me.
Precisely. It's establishing this sense of gratitude, this obligation on Israel's part. It's like, look, I went through all this for you. Now it's your turn to show your loyalty.
Yeah, like I did my part, now you do yours. And that leads into the condition, right?
Absolutely. In Exodus 19, verse 5, God lays out the condition. Obedience. They have to listen to his voice and keep the terms of the covenant. It's very much an if-then kind of agreement.
If you do this, then good things will happen. So what were those promised benefits? What was in it for the Israelites if they kept their end of the bargain?
Well, God promised some pretty amazing things. In Exodus 19, verses 5 and 6, he says they would be his treasured possession among all peoples, a kingdom of priests, and a holy nation.
Treasured possession, that's like being deeply loved and valued by God. But what about this kingdom of priests thing? What does that even mean?
Our source explains that really well.
Yeah.
You know, a priest acts as a kind of mediator between God and people. So for Israel to be a kingdom of priests meant they had this unique role, like representing God to the rest of the world, sharing his laws and teachings.
Like ambassadors.
Yeah, exactly. And also representing humanity to God, bringing prayers and offerings. It's actually a direct connection back to that promise in the Abrahamic covenant, that through Abraham's descendants, all the families of the world would be blessed.
So it wasn't just about them being special or privileged. They were chosen to serve a purpose for the good of everyone.
That's exactly right. And a holy nation. That just means being set apart for God and his purposes.
Dedicated to him. So what did they say to this proposal?
Well, in Exodus 19, verse 8, and then later in Exodus 24, verses 7 and 8, it says they all agreed, like unanimously, all that the Lord has spoken we will do.
Wow, that's a big commitment.
Huge. And that's the moment, that really solidified Israel as God's covenant nation, the start of what our source calls God's political kingdom on earth, marked by their obedience, their worship, and God's presence dwelling among them.
So we've got this formal agreement, this covenant, with all its expectations and promises. And right at the heart of it are the Ten Commandments. Our source calls them the core of God's law, like the ultimate expression of how he feels about sin.
And what's interesting about these Ten Commandments is their structure. The first four, dealing with our relationship with God, they were initially seen as exclusive to Israel. Although other societies might have adopted similar principles later on. And these first four often come with explanations.
Explanations, like God knew we might need some extra help understanding them.
Yeah, in a way. They lay the foundation. Then the last six commandments, they focus more on our relationships with each other, within the community. And those are recognized as pretty universal moral principles. They don't usually have those explicit explanations attached, although the fifth one does have a motivation given.
Okay, so let's break these down one by one. First up, the big one. You shall have no other gods before me. Exodus 20.3. That seems pretty straightforward.
It does. But the explanation before it, in Exodus 20, verse 2, is crucial. It says, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery.
So it's like a direct link back to the Exodus.
Exactly. Our source points out that this explanation actually applies to the whole set of commandments, but especially to this first one. It's establishing the foundation. It's like God saying, remember who rescued you. That's why your loyalty belongs to me.
Yeah, like, you owe me this at least. But this phrase, no other gods before me, it implies that maybe other gods actually do exist. Was that how people thought back then?
That's a really good question. And our source suggests that it probably meant, no other gods in addition to me, not necessarily no gods in preference to me. Because especially after those plagues targeting the Egyptian gods, God was forbidding them from honoring or worshiping or, trusting in any other supposed deity besides Yahweh. And this was a big deal back then because most cultures in the ancient Near East, they had all these different gods they worshipped.
Polytheism.
Right. But God was making it clear. I'm the only true God. No sidekicks, no sharing the stage. You're with me or you're not.
So it's a total break from the norm. But then you mentioned that Moses later clarifies that there actually aren't any other real gods. It seems like a bit of a contradiction.
It is a tricky point. But our source explains that while there aren't any other truly divine beings, like Deuteronomy 4.35 and 32.39 make clear, people back then, especially coming from places like Egypt, they often imagined or attributed divine power to all kinds of things. So God's command was like an absolute ban on participating in any other religious system besides his own. And the bottom line, the consequence of disobeying this first commandment is putting anything at all above God.
Like your job, your possessions, your hobbies.
Yeah, anything that becomes more important than him. Okay, on to the second commandment. You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. Exodus 20.4-6. This is the one about idols, right?
Yeah, no graven images. Pretty clear cut.
Well, it's actually deeper than just idols for false gods. It also forbids making images, even to worship the true God. Because, as Deuteronomy 4.1:18 explains, God is spirit, and you can't really capture that in a physical form. No image can truly represent him.
Like trying to put the ocean in a bottle.
Yeah, something like that. Remember when Moses asked to see God's true self?
Oh, yeah, in Exodus.
Well, in Exodus chapters 33 and 34, when Moses asked to see God's glory, what God revealed were his spiritual attributes like compassion, grace, justice, not a physical form.
So it's about understanding that God is beyond any physical representation.
Exactly. And this commandment also talks about God being a jealous God.
That always sounds a bit possessive, doesn't it?
Our source explains that it's not like human jealousy, which is often based on insecurity. It's more like God's passionate commitment to his people and his desire for their undivided loyalty. Like, the commitment you'd expect in a loving marriage.
So making an image of God misrepresents him and kind of provokes the strong reaction because it's like a betrayal of that exclusive relationship.
Right. And the consequence here is not just making idols of false gods, but even trying to represent the true God with physical images. All right, third commandment. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. Exodus 20.7. What does in vain even mean here?
Yeah, that's always a bit unclear.
Our source says the literal translation is more like, do not lift up the name of the Lord your God to vanity. And vanity here means like emptiness or worthlessness, maybe even falsehood.
Okay, so not using his name in a meaningless way.
Right. One interpretation is it forbids using God's name alongside other religions, like mixing faiths, which Zephaniah 1.5 also mentions. But the first commandment already kind of covers that, so there's got to be more to it.
So what else could it mean?
Well, it could be about making false oaths, Like if you swear on God's name to tell the truth, but you're lying, that's using his name in vain, because God wouldn't back up a lie.
Makes sense.
It could also be about trying to manipulate God, like thinking that just by saying his name, you can somehow control him. That would be vain because it wouldn't work.
So it's not just what you do, but also the intention behind it.
Exactly. But the main point, our source says, is that you can't use God's name lightly or disrespectfully. Whether it's a false oath or a curse word or just casual joking, it all shows a lack of reverence for who he is. Remember, in ancient cultures, a name represented the person, so misusing God's name is like disrespecting him directly. And the consequence is clear. God won't let it slide. Moving on to the fourth commandment. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy? 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. Exodus 20.8-11. Everyone knows about the Sabbath, right? The day of rest.
Yeah, taking a break.
Right. The Hebrew word Shabbat literally means to cease or to rest. And our source explains that they observed it by worshiping, offering extra sacrifices, and not working.
And why was it so important? Like, why command a day of rest?
Well, two main reasons. First, Exodus 20.11 says God himself rested after creation, so the Sabbath was like a reminder of that and a sign of the covenant, with God as creator and redeemer. Exodus 31.7 talks about that too.
So it's like mirroring God's own actions.
Exactly. But then in Deuteronomy 5.15, there's this other reason added, remembering their slavery in Egypt and ensuring everyone, families, servants, even foreigners, gets a break.
So it's also about social justice, about being compassionate and recognizing everyone's need for rest.
Precisely. God's kingdom was supposed to be different from the harshness of Egypt. And even though the specific way of observing the Sabbath has changed over time, that core principle of regular rest, making time for spiritual things that's still relevant today.
Definitely. Okay, on to the fifth commandment. This is the first one that directly deals with our relationships with other people. Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. Exodus 20.pool. Sounds like a rule for kids, right?
Well, it starts there, for sure. But our source points out that honor goes way beyond just obeying your parents as a kid. The Hebrew word for honor here means treating someone as important, with respect and value.
So even when you're an adult, you still have this obligation to your parents.
Yeah. Even if you don't always agree with them, you still have to treat them with respect, care for them, not badmouth them. Dishonoring your parents, our source says, is like undermining the whole idea of family, which God established.
Makes sense. Okay, number 6. You shall not murder. Exodus 20.13. This one seems pretty self-explanatory.
Yeah, no killing. But it's worth pointing out that our source clarifies that not all killing was forbidden in the Mosaic law. Like warfare and legal executions, those were allowed under certain conditions. This commandment is specifically about the intentional taking of innocent life, what we'd call premeditated murder.
And why is murder such a big deal?
Because humans are made in God's image, so killing someone is like attacking God himself. It devalues what he values. And the consequence is taking a life based on your own selfish or hateful motives. It's a violation of the sanctity of human life.
All right, commandment number 7, you shall not commit adultery, Exodus 20.14. This one's about faithfulness in marriage.
Yeah, it forbids any messing around in someone else's marriage. It's all about respecting that commitment between husband and wife. And our source actually says that later teachings expand on this, saying that even having strong desires for someone who's not your spouse is a violation.
Wow, so even thoughts can be a problem.
That's right. Adultery is the consequence of letting those desires grow and fester.
Okay, number 8, you shall not steal, Exodus 20.15. This one's about respecting what belongs to others.
Exactly. It's the foundation for personal property rights. You can't just take what's not yours.
Seems simple enough.
Yeah, but think about the values behind it. It's about respecting boundaries and the effort someone put into acquiring something. Okay, number 9, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. Exodus 20.16. Truthfulness.
No lying, especially in court.
Right. It specifically mentions perjury, lying under oath, which could have serious consequences. But the principle applies to any kind of dishonesty, anytime you misrepresent the truth.
And finally, number 10, you shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife or his male servant or his female servant or his ox or his donkey or anything that is your neighbor's. Exodus 20.16. This one's different. It's about what's going on inside your head.
Yeah, it goes beyond outward actions and deals with your inner desires. It's not just about not stealing stuff. It's about not even wanting what belongs to someone else.
So envy, jealousy, those are problems too.
Exactly. Our source points out that this commandment shows that sin can happen even in your thoughts without any outward action. And the consequence here is allowing yourself to be consumed by those desires.
So we've gone through all 10. When you look at them together, what do they tell us about God?
They paint a pretty clear picture of his character. He's holy, just, fair, powerful, all-knowing. He's involved in his creation, not just watching from afar. He wants our exclusive devotion, no sharing with other gods. His name is sacred, and he set up a rhythm of rest for us and for himself.
Sounds like he's got high standards.
Yeah, he does. He also established the family unit, values human life, and demands purity and self-control. He embodies justice and truth and is content with what he has. And our source emphasizes that these laws were unique for their time. They stood out against the immorality and the kind of chaotic nature of the gods worshipped in other ancient cultures. Ultimately, God's laws, even when they seem restrictive, are for our own good.
So what about us? What do these laws reveal about humanity?
Well, they show us how far we fall short. They're like a mirror reflecting our flaws. We're morally weak, rebellious, prone to sin, selfish, greedy. Our source says that when we honestly measure ourselves against God's perfect standards, none of us come out looking perfect.
It's like those commandments highlight our imperfections. And that leads to this idea of guilt and sin. Our source says breaking even one law is enough to make you guilty. That seems harsh.
Well, think about Adam and Eve. They disobeyed just one command, and the consequence was spiritual death, separation from God. God is perfectly holy, and even one sin creates a gap between us and him.
So to recap, we've gone from imagining life with no laws to understanding the Mosaic covenant and its historical context. We've seen how it shaped Israel's identity and mission, and we've broken down each of the 10 commandments, seeing what they reveal about God and ourselves.
And it all leads to a pretty big question for you to think about. If breaking even one law separates us from a perfect God, what does that say about how high the bar for righteousness really is?
Yeah.
And what does it mean for how we understand our actions, even the ones that seem small or insignificant?
It really makes you think about how we relate to God and the standards he has.
Absolutely. We encourage you to keep exploring these ideas. Think about what the 10 Commandments mean in your own life and in today's world. Maybe even look into the broader Mosaic law and how it applied those principles. There's a lot to discover if you're willing to dig deeper.